thank you for tuning in to the Child Anxiety FAQ podcast. FAQ stands for Frequently Asked Questions, and I'm answering your questions about child and teen anxiety. My name is Dawn Friedman, and I have been working with kids and families for more than 3 decades now, including as a preschool teacher, a school-age site director, parent educator, family case manager, clinical counselor, and now as the owner and operator of Child Anxiety Support, a program for parents of anxious kids. I almost said anxious parents, and let's face it, that's often true. In fact, it is true. We tend to be anxious about our child's anxiety. Anyway, each week I answer questions that have been submitted by you, my listeners, and this week's question is, how can I get my anxious child to use their coping tools? Now, this came from a listener whose child is seeing a therapist and is learning a lot of the CBT, that's cognitive behavioral therapy tools that are necessary and research informed when it comes to anxiety. This child is older elementary, and the parent reports, even though my child knows what to do, I cannot get them to do it. Well, you probably are feeling this a little bit too, and maybe you have taught your child some of the CBT coping tools. But actually, coping tools are not necessarily going to be part of the cognitive behavioral therapy that we do with anxious kids. Coping tools like calm down tools, relaxation tools are actually not supposed to be part of the picture. The research actually tells us that helping kids learn how to relax is not that helpful. I was just reading a book about this and then dug into the studies that they cited in the book. And I was talking to a colleague about it. I thought it was really funny because they were saying there are evidence-based reasons why not to teach children about anxiety, which I'll get to. But the third reason, which was not cited, was one that every therapist knows, which is kids don't practice them. They don't practice the coping tools, and generally their parents aren't practicing them with them either. Now, listen, I think learning calm down tools is great. I think learning mindfulness and learning how our body feels when we are calm is terrific. And I think there's real benefit to that. Just because if we're always wound up, we might forget how our body feels when it feels good. And also because when families are working on anxiety stuff, kids are often not getting time just to not think about their anxiety, just to be a person in flow, playing with their Legos, running around outside. And so bringing more of that in is great. But when it comes to managing anxiety, it's not that helpful. And I will share why, according to the research. And the first is there is no research that says that children with anxiety are chronically dysregulated. Are they dysregulated when they're anxious? Absolutely. But they're not chronically dysregulated. They are not people who are living permanently in dysregulation any more than people without anxiety. So they're saying they don't necessarily need to learn to relax more than any other person might need to learn to relax. It doesn't seem like that is actually such an important skill when it comes to anxiety. And then the other reason, and this is the one I wanted to talk about in the context of this question, is that if we tell them to relax, we're actually telling them avoid that anxious feeling. Avoid it. Oh, you're anxious, you're all hepped up. Take a deep breath and let that anxiety go. And that sounds good. It sounds good, except that anxiety at the heart, a dysfunctional anxiety at the heart, is about avoidance of the yucky feeling of the anxiety itself. All right. So we have to learn to feel anxious in order to overcome it. If we're calming ourselves down so much that we are not feeling the anxiety, then we're not actually acclimating to the anxiety, and we're likely still avoiding. We're using that coping tool as a means for avoidance instead of powering through. Now, I think that this is a more complicated concept than it appears when I share it here. And so I expect when I'm sharing it that you might feel a little confused. Like, what? So when my kid is completely melting down or vomiting from anxiety, I'm just supposed to say, good luck to you, do the terrible thing anyway. And I would say, no, 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 because a child that is completely falling apart is too deep in that anxiety, too overwhelmed by the anxiety to power through the anxiety. And so when a child is having such big behaviors, that tells me that we need to pull back a little bit. And actually, when we're talking about anxiety treatment and talking about exposure, we don't want to flood the child. Now, there is a treatment that's about flooding, blah, 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 but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about you and your child, and flooding, that's overwhelmed with anxiety. That's a child in the middle of a panic attack. A child who's in the middle of a panic attack is not going to be able to do this scary thing because they're too busy having a panic attack. We would start smaller. We would start smaller earlier in the area in which they are anxious, and we would create an intervention plan that's a stair step. So up here at the very tippy top of the stairs is the anxious thing we want them to confront, but there's all these steps to get there, and we want to have a plan to go through that. And that's actually, it's a fear hierarchy. Sometimes they call it a fear ladder, lots of different words for it. We would create a step by step by step by step intervention. But nowhere are we like, you need to calm down. Nowhere are we saying, don't feel anxious. We're saying, feel anxious, know you're feeling anxious, know that's what it is, and do the thing anyway. Super simple, really, when you think about it, right? But of course, it's much more complicated to figure out how to build out that exposure plan. On a very basic level, it's if a child is afraid of public speaking, we might have them read their paper to us, and then we might have them read it on camera, and then we might have them read it to their grandparents, whatever, before we get to the place where they're reading it in front of school. We would do these step by step by step. We would be talking about motivation. We would be talking about plans for if we go too fast, if we're going too slow, if our child is not motivated. That's the big picture. We would be working on all of those details. But at the core, if you're like, why isn't my child using their coping tools? Well, the answer is the coping tools, they probably cannot access them when they are fully anxious. And the coping tools might just be another way we get stuck in avoidance. Now, obviously, it is much, like I said, more complicated than this, and some coping tools might be necessary to help them manage those symptoms of anxiety. But the goal is not to make those symptoms of anxiety disappear. We're not saying, I want you to breathe deep so your stomach isn't doing flippy flops. We want to say, your stomach is doing flippy flops because you're anxious. Let's just let ourselves feel that and know it doesn't mean anything other than our bodies are anxious. We do know from the research that children with anxiety are more sensitive to the feelings of anxiety. In other words, we all might have fears of public speaking, but somebody who has anxiety about public speaking enough that it gets in the way of, say, presenting in class might be more sensitive to that nervous feeling that comes from public speaking. Not that the rest of the world is just free and clear, never feeling anxiety. We all feel anxiety to some extent. People with anxiety disorders seem to be more sensitive to the feelings of anxiety and or are more sensitive to the messages that are coming to us. And that's the cognitive part of cognitive behavioral therapy. I'll get into that another time. In any case, if you have a question about this episode, or if you have a question you would like me to address on another episode, you can go to my website and post it there, childanxietysupport.com. Just go up to podcast in the menu, and that's where you'll see the form for sending me your questions. And also you can see how to schedule a quick consult with me if you want to meet and see if my program might be a fit for your family. Thanks a lot and have a great week.